Every great story is an iron odyssey, a long and difficult journey that tests the very limits of human endurance and will. Follow our characters as they navigate the rocky paths of fate to find their ultimate home. Subscribe today and join the most epic journey of the digital age.
My sister sent me a text at 6:47 on a Thursday morning that said, "Hey, you still remember the Cardinals?" I was standing in my kitchen in Raleigh, still in the clothes I'd slept in, waiting for coffee. I read the message twice. Then I sat down. The Cardinals. We hadn't said that to each other in maybe 25 years. When we were kids growing up in Akron, our father had this thing where he'd get into these moods, not violent, not mean in the way that word usually implies, just gone somewhere inside himself that we couldn't reach. He'd sit at the kitchen table and drink and talk in circles about things that made no sense. Old arguments, old slights, none of it connected to anything that was happening. Our mother had taught us, my sister and I, to watch for the Cardinals. There was a feeder outside the back window, and if you looked out and counted 3 cardinals at once, it meant something good was coming. She made it up. I knew that even as a kid, but she also made it our signal. If things got too much inside the house, one of us would text or whisper or write on a scrap of paper, the Cardinals, and the other one would find a reason to say we had to go somewhere. A homework project. A neighbor needing help. Anything to get us both out. We hadn't needed that signal in decades. My sister was 54 years old. She lived in Greenville, South Carolina, in a house she'd shared with her husband, Patrick, who had died 14 months before from a brain aneurysm. 47 years old. No warning. He left for work on a Tuesday and didn't come home. I'm 58. I spent 26 years working in financial compliance for a mid-size investment firm in Charlotte before moving to a consulting role. I've reviewed hundreds of prospectuses. I've flagged fraudulent disclosures, sat in on SEC referral discussions, trained junior analysts to spot the language that sounds like something but means nothing. It's a very specific kind of reading. You learn to hear what's underneath the words. I read my sister's text again. "You still remember the Cardinals?" I called her. She didn't answer. I texted back, "On here. Call me when you can." Then I got in the car. She met me at the door in a bathrobe at 10:30 in the morning, which told me something before she said a word. My sister is not a bathrobe at 10:30 person. She was one of those people who made her bed every morning even after Patrick died, even in the worst of it, because she said it was the one thing she could control. Seeing her at the door like that, hair still flat from sleep, holding her coffee mug with both hands, I understood that whatever was happening had been happening for a while. We sat at her kitchen table, the one she and Patrick had bought together at an estate sale in 2019, the one she told me she was never getting rid of. She looked out the window for a moment, and then she looked at me and said, "I think I've done something really stupid." His name was Jeffrey Colborn. She'd met him 4 months earlier through an online grief support group. I didn't even know she'd been in a grief support group. That was the first thing that landed on me. She hadn't told me. She said she didn't want me to worry. She said she just needed somewhere to talk to people who understood, people who weren't also grieving Patrick, people who didn't look at her with that particular careful expression that everyone in her real life had been wearing for 14 months. Jeffrey was in the group too. He said he'd lost his wife 2 years prior. A stroke, he said. He was 56, semi-retired, had spent his career in commercial real estate development in Phoenix. He was warm in the way that certain people are warm, immediately, specifically, like they'd already thought about what you needed before you arrived. He remembered details she mentioned in passing. He followed up on things. He asked her how a specific appointment had gone a week after she mentioned it. After about 6 weeks in the group, he messaged her privately. He said he hoped that wasn't too forward, but that he'd found her perspective really grounding, and he'd appreciate the chance to talk more directly if she was open to it. She was open to it. They talked by phone every few days, then every day, then for longer. He was thoughtful and patient, and he made her laugh in a way that she said felt like remembering something she thought she'd lost for good. I was sitting at her kitchen table, and I was keeping my face very neutral while she told me all of this, and I was doing the thing I used to do in review meetings, the thing where you listen for the shape of what someone is describing, not just the content. What I was hearing was targeted, gradual, patient, warm, all of the words people use to describe something genuine, but in my experience, And this is the thing about financial fraud and most con artistry. The words people use to describe something genuine and the words people use to describe the early stages of a sophisticated manipulation are almost identical. That's not an accident. She told me about the money 6 minutes into the conversation. She almost skipped past it the way people do when they're ashamed, burying it in the middle of a longer sentence about something else. He had mentioned a few weeks back that he was involved in a real estate syndication deal in the Carolinas. He said it almost casually, not as a pitch, just as context. He said a few of his former associates were putting together a private equity pool to fund a mixed-use development project outside of Charlotte. The returns were projected at 16 to 18% annually. The minimum buy-in was $25,000, but given his relationship with the lead developer, he could get her in at a lower threshold if she was interested. She had listened to all of this. She had not said yes, but she had not said yes. But she had not said no either. Last week, he had mentioned it again. Gently. He said the closing window for the investor round was approaching, end of the month, and that he wanted her to know the door was open, but he completely understood if it wasn't the right time given everything she'd been through. He was not pushy about it, she said. That was the thing that kept getting her. He was never pushy about it. I asked her how much she had in savings. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when we were kids, and I'd asked her something she didn't want to answer. Then she told me. Patrick had a life insurance policy. It wasn't enormous, but it was substantial. She had been careful with it. She had a financial advisor. She was not reckless. But she had told Jeffrey about the insurance money. Not the exact figure, but enough. I took a slow drink of my coffee, and I set the mug down, and I asked her if he had ever suggested a meeting in person. She said yes, actually. He had said he was going to be in South Carolina in 2 weeks, and he'd love to finally meet her face to face. She had said she'd think about it. I asked her if she'd sent him any money. She looked down at the table and shook her head. No, she hadn't. She'd wanted to talk to me first. That was why she'd sent the text. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine, and I didn't say anything for a few seconds because there wasn't anything to say yet. She had done the most important thing. She had stopped before anything moved. I told her that. Then I told her I needed to get to work. I drove to the Holiday Inn 2 miles from her house, and I checked in, and I sat on the bed with my laptop and my notepad, and I started from the beginning. Jeffrey Colburn, commercial real estate, Phoenix, semi-retired, wife deceased 2 years ago, stroke. The first thing I looked for was the death record. People who lose a spouse usually have an obituary, a social media post somewhere, a funeral home record that makes it into Google. Something. I searched variations of the name and the wife's presumed name, which my sister didn't know, and Phoenix, and the year range he would have given. I found nothing that matched. I tried to find him in Arizona real estate licensing records, which are public. Nothing. I found a LinkedIn profile. It was thin. Fewer than 80 connections, no recommendations, no listed colleagues who could be cross-referenced. The employment history showed 3 companies over 15 years, none of which, when I searched them individually, had any verifiable internet presence from before 2020. I called a man I used to work with named Arthur Peck, who had left compliance and gone to work for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Charlotte about 8 years ago. We weren't close exactly, but we'd collaborated on a referral case in 2018, and he had given me his direct number. I texted him that evening and asked if he had 20 minutes. He called me that night. I told him what I had and what I didn't have. He asked me a few questions, the name, the Phoenix connection, the grief group angle. That last part made him quiet for a second. He said he'd make some calls in the morning. I called my sister that night. She sounded small in a way that had nothing to do with volume. She said she kept going over it and she couldn't tell which parts were real and which parts weren't. And that was the worst part, not knowing where the line was. I told her that was by design, that this was not a reflection of her intelligence or her judgment. The people who do this are skilled at making exactly that boundary impossible to locate. She didn't say anything for a bit. Then she said, "I really like talking to him." And I said, "I know. That's the point. That's what makes this work." She asked me if I thought he cared about her at all, and I told her the honest answer, which is that I didn't know, and that in a way it didn't matter. What she felt was real. What he had done with that was something else entirely. Arthur called me at 8:20 the next morning. He said the name didn't come up directly, but the method did. There was an open investigation involving a network of individuals targeting recently widowed women through online grief forums. The operation had been running across at least 5 states: South Carolina, Ohio, Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia. The approach was consistent: establish emotional contact through a legitimate-seeming support community, build a relationship over several months, introduce a private investment opportunity with a closing deadline, collect wire transfers before disappearing. The investment vehicle varied. Sometimes it was real estate. Sometimes it was private lending. Sometimes it was something involving digital assets. The details changed, but the arc never did. He said investigators had identified at least 11 victims so far. The total in losses across those cases was somewhere north of $1.4 million. The individuals running the operation were organized. They had fake but sophisticated digital presences. They knew how to move money quickly once it transferred. In most cases, by the time the victim realized anything was wrong, the funds were already fragmented across multiple accounts. My sister had not transferred anything. That was the only thing I could hold on to. Arthur said he needed to talk to her, officially, and that if she was willing to cooperate, there was a path forward. He was very careful about what he said and what he didn't say. He was doing his job, and doing it well. He also said something that I wrote down on my notepad because I wanted to remember it exactly. He said, in every one of these cases, the victim knew something was wrong before they could name what it was. Every single one. And the ones who didn't lose money were the ones who told someone before they convinced themselves it was nothing. I drove back to my sister's house that afternoon. I sat across from her at the same kitchen table, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. She had always been better at that than me. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The grief group. Do you think any of the other women in it are also being—" I said I didn't know, but that Arthur would look into it. She pressed her palms flat on the table. She had Patrick's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. She had worn it there since he died. She looked down at the table for a long moment, and then she looked up at me with a particular expression I hadn't seen on her face in a long time, something hard and clear beneath all of it. She said, "What do I need to do?" Arthur needed her to keep the communication open, not to confront Jeffrey, not to change her tone, not to say anything that might tip him off. Just to continue the conversation as though nothing had changed, and to let Arthur's team guide her through it from there. She was not. He was clear about this, going to be asked to meet him in person. That was off the table. But she could respond to his messages. She could tell him she was still thinking about the investment opportunity. She could let him continue to believe that the closing deadline was still working in his favor. She looked at me and asked if I thought she could do it. I said I knew she could. She'd spent 14 months handling something far worse than this, every single day. She met with Arthur the following morning at a coffee shop downtown. I sat with her, but I didn't speak. She answered his questions in that quiet, precise way she'd always had. She signed what needed to be signed. She asked one question of her own at the end. Is it possible that anything he said was true? Arthur looked at her carefully and said that the investigation was ongoing, and he couldn't speak to specifics. What he could say was that the pattern they were looking at was consistent and deliberate, and that it had been applied to multiple women in exactly her situation. She nodded. She didn't say anything else about it. Over the next 10 days, she maintained the conversation. She told Jeffrey she'd been reviewing the opportunity more seriously. She asked questions about the investment structure, the kind of questions a genuinely interested person might ask, because Arthur had helped her know what to ask. Jeffrey answered them smoothly. He had answers for everything. He mentioned the closing deadline again, same language, same gentle pressure, same reassurance that he completely understood if she wasn't ready. He also said he'd been thinking about her a lot. He said he hoped she knew how much their conversations had meant to him. She told me that part in a text, very late at night, and I didn't know what to say to it, so I just called her and we talked about something else for a while until she sounded steadier. The arrest happened on a Wednesday. I found out from Arthur by phone and then called my sister immediately. She was already in her car. She'd pulled over in a parking lot, and when she picked up, I could hear she'd been crying. She said she wasn't sad about him. She wanted me to know that. She said she was crying because it was a lot. All of it at once, knowing it was over, knowing what it had been, knowing there were other women who weren't as close to the edge as she'd been. I told her she'd done something that most people in her position would not have done. She said she'd just sent a text. I know, I said. That's the thing that mattered. 2 of the other women in the grief support group had already transferred money before the investigation closed in. One had sent $12,000. The other had sent $43,000. There were women in other states who had lost more. The network had been operating for nearly 2 years. The individuals involved had used at least 3 different platform identities across different grief communities, rotating them, retiring them when a thread got too long, creating new ones. My sister didn't know most of this until later. I didn't tell her all of it at once. Some things you have to let people absorb in pieces. 6 weeks after it was over, she drove up to Raleigh for the weekend. We had dinner at this Italian place near my house that she's always liked, and then we came back and sat on the back porch and watched it get dark. She'd started going to a different grief group, an in-person one at a church in Greenville, and she said it was good. Real, she said. It felt real in a different way. At some point, she said, I keep wondering when I should have known. I told her there wasn't a when. That the reason these things work is that the early stages are indistinguishable from something genuine. The attention, the consistency, the warmth, it's not fake in the way that amateur liars are fake, where you can see the edges. It's constructed from real time and real effort. The falseness is in the purpose, not the delivery. And the purpose is almost always hidden until it's too late. She was quiet for a bit and then she said, but I did know. Eventually, something kept catching. That's the thing I can't stop thinking about. She knew. Not fully, not in words, but there was something that kept catching, as she put it, some resistance that she couldn't rationalize away completely. And instead of talking herself out of it the way most people do, she sent me a text message with a 25-year-old code word that we'd invented for a completely different kind of danger. That instinct, the one that knows before the rest of you does, is not nothing. I want to be very clear about that. It is not paranoia. It is not weakness. It is not a failure of romance or openness or trust. It is the thing that kept my sister from losing the most tangible piece of what Patrick left behind. It is the thing that gave investigators enough time to close in on a network that had already taken nearly $200,000 from other women who didn't have someone to call or didn't call when they should have. If you have lost someone and you are grieving and someone comes into that space and is warm and patient and present in ways you didn't expect, I am not telling you that person is dangerous. I am telling you that grief makes us available in ways we don't always recognize. It opens something that we would otherwise protect more carefully, and that openness is not a flaw. It is part of being human. But it can be seen and it can be targeted. A few things to watch for. Anyone who introduces a financial opportunity after an emotional relationship has been established, not before. Projected returns that sound significantly above market, anything consistently above 8 or 10% annually for a private fund, should prompt serious questions. A deadline that creates urgency, the closing window, the last slot, the preferred tier that expires at month end, reluctance to provide documentation that can be independently verified, an address or company name that cannot be confirmed through public records. In the United States, legitimate investment advisors must be registered with the SEC or their state securities regulator. You can verify any advisor at investor.gov. It takes less than 5 minutes and it is free. And this, if someone in your life sends you a signal, any signal, the text that doesn't quite make sense, the question that is really a question about something else, the too casual mention of something that isn't casual at all, please don't make them explain it. Just call them. Just show up. My sister sent me 3 words on a Thursday morning and I got in the car and drove 4 hours and sat down at her kitchen table and listened. That's all I did. Everything else followed from that. The cardinals are still on her back reader. She keeps it filled. She said Patrick used to fill it and she's not going to stop just because he isn't there to do it anymore. Last time I visited, we sat at the kitchen table with our coffee and counted 3 of them out there at once, all red against the gray February sky. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We just sat there and let it mean what it meant. I've thought about cause and effect a lot over the course of my career. 26 years in financial compliance will do that to you. You spend enough time tracing how one decision led to another led to a loss that someone spent a lifetime building, and you start to see the chain clearly. Not fate, not luck, just choices, stacked on top of each other, each one making the next one more or less likely. What happened to my sister follows that same chain, and I think it's worth naming it plainly. Patricia lost Patrick. That loss opened something in her, the way grief does, a kind of rawness that made her need connection in a way she hadn't needed it since we were kids scared in a house that didn't always feel safe. She went looking for people who understood that feeling. That was not a weakness. That was a reasonable human response to an unbearable thing. The choice that followed from it. Trusting a group. Trusting a voice that was consistent and warm, that was also reasonable. Most people in that group were there for exactly the reason they said they were. Jeffrey, or whoever he actually was, made a different set of choices. He chose to be in that space not because he was grieving, but because he understood that grieving people are open in ways that other people aren't. He chose patience. He chose warmth as a tool. He chose a woman who had recently lost her husband and received a life insurance payout and was too isolated in her grief to have many people looking closely at what was happening around her. Every one of those choices was deliberate. That's the part I want people to sit with. He wasn't acting on impulse. This was constructed, and the construction worked nearly because it was built out of things that are genuinely good: attention, care, consistency, and hollowed out on the inside. My sister's choice to send me that text is the link in the chain that changed everything else. She could have talked herself out of it. She almost did, I think. She'd been rationalizing small things for weeks the way you do when you don't want the thing you're starting to suspect to be true. But she didn't fully let go of what her gut was telling her. She held on to it just enough to reach out. And that reaching out is what gave us the time we needed. That's the part about intelligence that I don't think gets discussed enough. Intelligence isn't just knowing things. It's knowing when you don't know something, when you're too close to a situation to see it clearly, when you need another set of eyes. Patricia is one of the smarter people I know. And the smartest thing she did in this entire situation was admit, even just to herself, that she wasn't sure. That admission cost her nothing. It saved her everything. And the grit she showed after that, sitting in that coffee shop with Arthur, maintaining her composure through 10 days of conversations with a man she now knew had been constructing something false around her. That wasn't easy. She did it anyway. Not because she was fearless. She wasn't. She did it because she'd already decided that fear wasn't going to be the thing that made the decision for her. The cardinals on her back feed her. I keep coming back to that image. She fills them because Patrick did. She doesn't do it to hold on. She does it because it's right, and she knows it's right, and that knowing doesn't require anything outside of herself to confirm it. That's what I want to leave you with. Not a warning, though the warning is real, but a reminder that the quiet thing you already know, the instinct that keeps catching, the text you're not sure whether to send, that is not nothing. Trust it. Act on it. Tell someone. Whatever comes next will follow from that.